Good afternoon and welcome to this Chemistry World webinar. I'm Ben Valsler, the digital editor of Chemistry World magazine. The point of the webinar today is to give you a general introduction as to how you can follow a structured risk assessment for new and expectant mothers who will be working with chemicals. There are of course special considerations to make and non-standard risk controls that you may need to adopt. By the end of the webinar we hope that you'll be able to conduct a suitable and sufficient assessment of risk and know where to find relevant guidance online and elsewhere. So we're going to be looking at the legal framework around this. We're looking at a guide for adequately identifying hazards and some of the typical types of control measures that may be required. The webinar itself is going to be recorded, so if you miss anything or if you have to leave early, then don't worry, we will send you a link to the recording after the fact so you can go back and watch it all again in case there are things that you just wanted a little bit more information about. Before I hand over to our guest speaker for the webinar, I just want to point out the GoToWebinar platform itself. There is the opportunity in there to ask us questions. So in the panel on the right hand side of your screen you should see a questions button or a questions box. In that you are more than welcome, in fact we encourage you to ask any questions that you have that are relevant to the webinar. We can easily put them to our guests during the webinar, or if we run out of time we will try and do our best to answer them after the fact. So do please put your questions in as and when they occur to you and we will come to questions at the end. There's also a chat box, so if you have any other general queries about GoToWebinar itself or about the platform or that sort of thing, feel free to put that in the chat box instead or in the questions box. Either way we will do our best to get those answers for you. So moving on, I would like to introduce our speaker, Ayla Bursnell. She is Health Safety Environment Consultant at Ayla Bursnell Limited. She's trained as a chemist and has a practical working knowledge of health, safety and environment management across all areas of health, safety, environment and hygiene, having worked for more than 20 years within the regulated and process-oriented chemical, pharmaceutical, intermediate and heavy manufacturing industries. So Ayla's going to take us through all of this. There will also be some polls where we want to get your opinion and your engagement later on in the talk, but with no further ado, I shall hand over to Ayla, who can take it away with the presentation. Ayla, thank you for joining us, and do please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much. This session really is a practical and relevant guidance on pregnancy risk assessment. It's actually quite general to cover all the aspects. And we will note that the background of a lot of people here is a chemical background. So a lot of the issues and aspects are already understood and available from some of the assessments you'll have already made. I think one of the main issues is confidentiality, and that's going to be quite a concern when conducting pregnancy risk assessments because of the nature of the information. And just to say that my first assessment that I actually did was for myself 15 years ago, and at the time I was a HSE manager on a pharmaceutical intermediate and chemical plant, and it was the first assessment because I was pregnant myself, so it was sitting in both boats really. Okay, so what I'd like to cover is an introduction and an overview of the session, look at the different legal frameworks because that's important, look at the risk assessment aspects in a bit more detail and be general really with identifying the hazards, evaluating the risk and control measures and looking at monitoring and review and the different periods for that. There'll also be a summary at the end and some guidance on references and further reading. And as Ben said, throughout the presentation there will be 3 poll questions just to keep everybody involved, and it's not just a set of PowerPoint slides. Okay, this webinar is intended to supplement the RSC Online Health and Safety Essential Elements module for new and expectant mothers, which is already available on the RSC website. So where I have made references, it will be to HSE guidance, the regulations and any publications that are easily available. We do have Google now, which is a great source of information out there, but I would tend to always go to the HSE website first because there's some excellent information there on new and expectant mothers. There's a whole web page for it. It's really aimed at providing more information around the practical aspects of the risk assessment process. So what I said earlier about being general, and it's also for people who are having to complete assessments involving others and for new and expectant mothers themselves, which is what I said about myself when I was doing this originally. And also I have put the information together and being quite careful to use the current guidance, but within your own organisations you will have legal advisors, your own representatives, medical professionals, qualified hygienists, and also your own procedures and systems. So really it's meant to be a substitute for that and to give you a bit more practical background of how to set things up, put together, and to supplement your own organisation's procedures. So now we'll just move to poll question 1.
Okay, excellent. So the way that these polls work is you are allowed to select one of the options that we've given you. The question, as you should see on your screen, what were the most helpful sources of information and support in your experience of pregnancy risk assessment so far? So if you have done a risk assessment for new and expectant mothers in your workplace, then please do vote away. I'm just going to give it a short while to make sure as many people as possible can vote, and once that levels out, then we'll pass this on and have a look at the answers. It may of course be that you haven't had to do this sort of risk assessment. If you haven't, then perhaps it might be worth thinking about where you would go first if you were having to do one for your own workplace. Would you go straight for Google, or would you go for the guidance and legislation options that are available? Hopefully there'll be people within your workplace who could help out. But if you know somewhere in particular that you would have gone, you're also welcome to put that in the questions comment or in the chat box if there's something that you found particularly helpful that we haven't listed or that isn't covered by the options ahead. Now people are still voting, so I'll give you a few more seconds just to make sure everybody that wants to can get their votes in, and we will then move on and see how this compares. So I can actually see a breakdown of the votes as they're coming in, and I have to admit they're not quite what I would have expected, knowing what the general breakdown of how people find information is. We seem to have reached a bit of a plateau now in terms of people who are voting, so I think we will close the poll now and then we will share the results. So these are the results that we had. So the majority, although a slim majority, have gone for the Health and Safety Executive website, and then other people are looking at the occupational health function, or in fact within their own organisation. I'm quite surprised that Google isn't up there higher. That seems to be the way that most people find out information. But Ayla, is this the sort of balance that you expected to see, or are any surprises in there for you?
Well, I'm actually quite pleased that we've got the HSE website coming out tops there. Because that's always up to date, and it also gives other guidance and publications and places to go to. And also people do have their own occupational health functions and their own organisations with medical professionals, medical directors, and people that are more familiar with the specific hazards for that organisation and industry. So that they come up very well. And Google, yes, is wonderful and excellent, but like everything, you will get lots of information which may not always be current or relevant to the country you're in, and it may not be up to date. So I think I'm quite pleased with that breakdown. But it's also nice to see the Royal Society of Chemistry does get some note there for the online modules that are on there, because there's lots of good information there as well.
I suppose the risk with diving straight into Google and your own research is that you could be reinventing the wheel, and there may be people in your organisation who've already done this before or who already have a good framework, and so it's always worth looking there first so that you don't just end up duplicating work that someone else has done.
Definitely, but there's a lot of information out there as well. So you have to filter it and be knowledgeable about what you're looking at. So I'd say HSE website and the occupational health functions is very good as the two top ones.
Excellent. Okay, we will close the results for the poll now so that you will be able to carry on from where you were. There are a couple more polls coming up, but thank you ever so much to everybody who answered those. We look forward to seeing your feedback for the next few. So Ayla, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you. Okay, so the next part of the introduction, some of the key learning points. So really to look at and understand the special considerations to be made within the risk assessment process for a new and expectant mother. As Ben said earlier, to be able to use a process to conduct a suitable and sufficient assessment of risk associated with the new and expectant mother at work, and to identify any control measures required. And as we've just said from the poll, to have the knowledge of further sources of information and guidance that's relevant, current and appropriate to assist with you to conduct that risk assessment. The scope for assessments, and as the regulations give, the new and expectant mother is someone considered as females who are pregnant, have given birth within the last 6 months, or are breastfeeding. And as you can see from that, it's quite a wide scope and a range with a substantial timeline there. And things change quite quickly in that timeline. So you've got the 3 different trimesters of pregnancy and the changes to the body, and then also you have a new mother returning back to work and some of the issues around that, and then the added on aspect of breastfeeding and the requirements and the hazards associated with that. So it does lead you to already think of the risk assessment process being quite dynamic and being needed to be reviewed on a regular basis as things change very often. Okay, so first looking at the legal framework. So there are specific laws relating to new and expectant mothers and their health and safety at work. And it's mainly contained in the management of health and safety at work regulations. So we all know that this has the duty to assess risk, but it's actually quite specific in certain sections, 16 to 18, that it's to do with any specific risks to females of childbearing age who could become pregnant, and any risks to new or expectant mothers. So your general risk assessments should have already covered any hazards to females of childbearing age and reproductive hazards. And if that risk is assessed arising from work, from any processes or working conditions, and looking at the different hazards such as physical, biological or chemical agents, then you need to consider measures. And these measures need to be introduced, and the phrase is to encourage improvements to the safety and health of pregnant workers who have recently given birth or are breastfeeding. And if under the management regs, if the risk has been identified and it cannot be avoided by taking the necessary preventative or protective measures, then the employer must take immediate action to remove, reduce or control the risk. So it's actually listed in the regulations that if the risk cannot be removed, then there is a duty to take the following actions. And the first action is to temporarily adjust the working conditions. So that could be to do with the area of work or the hours of work. So perhaps making a shorter day, looking at shift work, and if that isn't possible to reduce the risk, then it's to offer suitable alternative work if that is available. So maybe work in another area for a certain length of time while the risk exists. And then the third action is the last resort, which is suspend from work on paid leave for as long as is necessary to ensure there's no risk to the individual. And a lot of these depend on the type of work, the risks, the hazards, and also the health of the individual. So there's a lot of different factors that are taken into account here. The next set of regulations is the Workplace Health, Safety and Welfare Regulations, and they contain a requirement, as well as for the general population, but workers who are pregnant, it's somewhere to rest and also to lie down if you're a new and expectant mother. So that needs to be thought of. Often this can be a first aid room or just somewhere quiet for people to go to. And it takes into consideration the aspects of pregnancy, such as nausea, tiredness, and also that facilities should be located nearby, such as toilets, where they can go to as well. The third part of the legal framework is the Equality Act, and that has a whole section on pregnancy and maternity equality. And I'm not going to cover any of the maternity legislation to do with human resources and pay and things like that, but they can be found on the government websites. So just looking at risk assessment, I'm sure everybody's very familiar with the risk assessment process, and I'm still going to be quite general here, but the key words are it's a structured and systematic examination, and it's of the premises, the processes, the work activities to identify what could cause harm to people and enable decisions to be made as to whether significant, sufficient precautions are in place or if more additional controls are required. You will have all your own systems and procedures for this already in place for general risk assessment. But here, talking about pregnancy risk assessments, I think what I've always used in the past is I've had my own procedures under fitness to work, so which looks at stress, fatigue management, but also looks at reproductive health. And I've had my own reproductive hazards risk assessment sheet really as an aid memoir and a process that I can follow. So when I've conducted the risk assessment, I've been armed with information and that is relevant to pregnancy, so I can conduct that risk assessment. The risk management issues related to the new and expectant mother are fairly well established, but you will find that the risks that are acceptable to the general workforce may not be acceptable to the new and expectant mother because of the transient nature of her vulnerability or because of the hazards that have been identified. For instance, originally when I was working in the pharmaceutical area, then we had R61, R63 chemicals harm to the unborn child, and that was something that I changed the way I was working, and I didn't enter that area for the time being of that. So the scope of general risk assessments, who might be harmed and how, should also take into account reproductive health, and not just of females but of males as well. So your general risk assessment will have already highlighted that. So you should be notifying people that they need to tell you if they become pregnant or breastfeeding or have given birth. So it's a requirement in there in the general risk assessment. It is an important factor to involve the new and expectant mother as much as possible during the risk assessment process, because it's all part of the information gathering. And when I've conducted them, I've involved sometimes a safety representative or a friend, someone from HR, and then gathered as much information as I could about the different hazards. And also taking the individual through a typical day to look systematically at all the different aspects that they were going to come into contact with. The other part of this is it's a very sensitive information, and it's about treating all conversations and documentation as confidential. And always in the past, I've made sure that any documentation I've had hasn't been as in general risk assessment format. It's been a medical or a HR document. So I may have been involved in preparing it and putting together, but then I will pass it over as a medical document. So then anything that's disclosed is done only with the agreement of the individual. So if we go now to the risk assessment process itself, which everybody will be familiar with this, it's the 5 steps to risk assessment, INDG 163, available on the HSE website, which is a standard format to look at risk assessment. So again, I'm being general here, but I will pull out some of the specific hazards for pregnancy and new mothers. So looking at the hazards and who might be harmed and how, evaluating the risks and deciding on precautions, recording your significant findings, and as I said before, making sure that these are recorded but held in a confidential format, and disclosing them really on a need-to-know basis with the permission of the individual, and then reviewing and updating as necessary. And because of the changes and the ongoing changes during pregnancy, it's very dynamic, so I would recommend review and update as necessary, but regularly. And now we have our second poll question.
Thank you very much. So the second poll question hopefully again should be up on your screen. Again, you can select one of the options we've given you. What are your biggest concerns about pregnancy risk assessment? So are you worried about having a systemic and thorough procedure to follow? Are you looking for assistance with identifying hazards, concerned about the controls that you'd have to put in place, or those confidentiality issues that we have just discussed? Again, we're going to keep an eye out while people are voting. If there are other things that you wanted to raise, of course, you can put those in the questions box. If you think that none of these quite answer your concerns, please do send them over in the questions box, and we will try and address them as best we can. I'm still watching the votes coming in, so I'll keep talking for a bit just as they go in. This is obviously a very specific webinar, but Chemistry World offers a range of other webinars on topics that are of interest to people who run small businesses or work for very large businesses. So do please keep an eye out to see what other webinars Chemistry World have that may be useful to you. This is not the first we've done on health and safety or risk assessment. We've looked at some of the regulations that are coming up as well. If those are the sorts of things that you are interested to know how you can make sure that you're compliant, what processes you need to put in place, then please join us for other webinars. Or if there's something that we haven't covered that you think would be very useful, then let us know and we'll see if we can find the right people to talk to you, just like we found the right person in AILA to talk to us about this. I think we've probably got oh, there's still more votes coming in even as I'm speaking, so I'm just going to give you that last wind for the last few people to vote. I think that will probably do, so we'll close the poll now. Don't worry if you didn't vote. It's not essential, it's just always really useful for us to know what it is that our audience are looking at. A reasonably good spread there, actually. The confidentiality doesn't seem to be a big issue. I guess that's something that people would predict and would know, that with these sorts of issues you have to be confidential. But actually everything else seems to be equally worrying. Ayla, is that what you expected to see?
Well, I'm pleased to say that I've set up the slides in the right way, because I've pitched it at systematic and thorough procedure to follow. So it's been general in those, and assistance with identifying the hazards. So that's where I've put the slides together on those two. Confidentiality, I imagine that, you know, in the health and safety field, people are very used to document control and confidentiality issues with injuries and incidents. So it's probably something that's you know, we've done this already many times. So that helps me with the rest of the presentation, because that's where I focused on.
Splendid. Okay, we will close the poll down now. There will still be another poll, so there's still another chance for people to get their opinions across. And again, that questions box is there for anything that occurs throughout the webinar. And I will hand back over to Ayla, and she can carry on.
Thank you. Okay, so back to identifying the hazards. So as we're armed with our process and procedure now, with everything set up to act as your memory jogger to identify the different hazards, then really it's anything with the potential to cause harm. And they can be grouped into different families, such as physical hazards, chemical hazards, biological hazards, and also looking at the ergonomic factors, some of the psychological issues such as stress, and the environmental ones. And when I mean environmental there, I mean things such as the outside environment and weather and things like that, the other aspects. Hazards can also exist in their own right or be generated during an activity or process. So there I'm thinking about things that can, they're not there at the start, but they are created by what you're doing. So these things are such as heat from ovens, or even things like computer rooms, where you can become exposed to heat that could create an effect on, you know, someone who is pregnant and unable to move around as much and be overcome by temperature. I'm also thinking things like confined spaces where you can't cool down the same, chemical intermediates generated during reactions and how to deal with those, and also things like awkward postures, lifting, carrying, things that normally you wouldn't even think about, but they may become an issue. So we're going to go into these in a bit more detail later on. And also just to take into account some of the non-routine activities. And I'm thinking here things that you'd normally take for granted, but due to fatigue issues, perhaps things like travel for work, airline travel, things like that, you might need to take into account differently. So look at the non-routines, access and egress from buildings. And again, a lot of these, it's to do with the different issues such as the hazards, the health of the individual, and any issues that are going on in addition to just the hazards. So that's why a specific risk assessment for this is much more valuable. So what I've usually done is, as I said earlier, visualized a process flow for a typical work activity, and I would talk to the individual and look in the work area and just say, well, show me what you do, and let's walk around it and let's step through the whole process. So then you are looking at the systematic review of all the hazards. And I'd say, you know, describe your typical day and the things that you do. Looking at general activities and the non-routine. There's also a lot of information there in existing risk assessments. So to pull all those together that cover the different risks. And familiarize yourself with the area. Because once again, you're the fresh pair of eyes that I always say I can ask the silly questions. You know, why are you doing that? What happens when, you know, maybe out of hours, or what happens when people aren't following all the processes and procedures that they should. So it's about being aware of what's going on. And another thing I always suggest is, even though you've got the risk assessment in place, on a daily basis, when you go into the area or you do something different, then do a pre-task risk assessment just to see if anything's changed. And that can just be just a tick box exercise on a piece of paper. I've used some little booklets called Stop, Think, Act, Review, or Take 5, which is just really, has anything changed today that I need to worry about? So having the formal system in place and also just a pre-task risk assessment as well is a good idea. Types of hazards, as I said, grouped into the different families. And I think from the backgrounds of everybody here, the types of hazards that we've got and the chemical hazards, hazardous substance information, may actually be more readily available and easy to get hold of and understood, with all those controls already in place as part of our original assessments that we've done. So that's going to be more familiar. So some of this may be looking about some of the other hazards that you may not be considering as an effect. So I'm going to take each one in turn: physical, chemical, biological, ergonomic, environmental, some of the psychological hazards, and then non-routine activities. So just thinking from what we said earlier about having that systematic approach to the risk assessment and going through each one and having your aid memoir and your documents and your information together ready for that. So just looking at the physical hazards here, and again, I'm not going to go into great detail on the physical hazards, but different examples include electricity, noise, radiation, heat, vibration, machinery, kinetic energy, potential energy, so a whole range of different physical hazards. Some of these have their own regulations in their own right due to the hazards and risk. So there'll also be general risk assessments out there for these. But I think it's, again, taking into account the specific risk for pregnancy and new mother, and thinking about how these risks affect them, because they may be more vulnerable due to the different issues. So thinking about your noise level in an area, just as an example, then it's well transmitted in the uterine environment, and development occurs in the first 24 to 28 weeks. So if you're looking at exposure to noise, especially in the early trimesters, it can be a risk for noise-induced hearing loss. And I just think, one of the examples that I've got was a lady who had to enter a heavy manufacturing area, and it was a hearing protection zone, and it did have high impact noise due to offloading of metal. And I think I'd worked out that she could be in that area for about 10 minutes a day before she exceeded any levels, and also that the high impact noise was too high for that area. And she was desperate to carry on doing that role and go into the area, but we really had to look at, due to the excessive noise and the high impact noise there, the risk was really too great, and somebody else could have done the task. We did it a different way, and somebody else picked up the information. So it's about looking at things differently, because it is actually a short period of time that you need to consider. Again, looking at heat caused by furnaces, ovens, equipment, enclosed spaces, confined spaces. Vibration, whole body vibration is also a risk. So if you're using mobile equipment, vibrating equipment, look at the hazards for that, as in forklift, truck driving, mobile vehicles. So everything might be fine with that. However, if you're driving over potholes, it does increase some of the risk. So look at vibration and shock from that. The radiation already has its own regulations, so has to be rigorously enforced there. So check manufacturer's instructions and data sheets for equipment information, and occupational sources of noise are any areas where hearing protection is required. So looking at the chemical hazards, then many substances are listed specifically affecting pregnant women that can cause harm to the unborn child or genetic damage. And you're already going to have general cost assessments that you've carried out for your processes for this. And it should be noted that occupational and workplace exposure limits do not take into account vulnerable individuals. And women working with hazardous substances should be made aware of any additional risks to themselves or the child. And I'm talking about reproductive toxicants here. I'm afraid I still talk in old money, which is the Dangerous Substances Directive and the risk levels, rather than the new CLP regulations. So I do apologise for that, but I do have a table that lists them all. A reproductive toxicant will impair the ability to conceive, cause harm to the offspring, or cause miscarriage or damage to the unborn child. So they have been listed in 3 different areas according to legislation. So the first one is toxic for fertility, developmental toxicity, and then toxic substances on or for lactation. And in this case also, it's just the risk of exposure that could cause stress. Amongst the chemical agents listed are also those causing cancer, heritable damage, toxic to cells. You've also got other hazards from metals. Again, they will have their own regulations and controls required, and exposure limits, carbon monoxide, and chemical agents that include pesticides. So here I have a table which just lists them, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with the new CLP classifications. But I do still talk in old money. So you've got R60 and R62 for fertility, 61 harm to the unborn child, and R63, and then 64 harm to breastfed babies, and the list of the CLP. So this is all part of your general cost assessments and looking at the different information that you will already have available and the controls in place for these. In the past, I have discussed controls with medical directors and occupational health physicians dealing with exposure to some of the R61 and R63. And when you think about it, the controls in place that are required have to be so rigorous, and there's a whole hierarchy of controls. They all have to work. And sometimes just the risk of exposure is enough to stress the individual, because all those controls have to be in place. So when you're talking about reproductive toxicants, sometimes it is recommended that removal from the area or not to handle these materials is probably best from a stress risk as well as a risk to the individual. But I would also stress that take advice from your own medical practitioners and occupational health people. But that's my experience of the organisations I've worked in. That's what's happened. So now moving to the biological hazards. The COSH regulations and the ACOP categorise and recommend containment and control measures that are likely to be appropriate to the risk of biological agents. And you have categories here, 2, 3 and 4. So 2 being moderate risk of disease, 3 being high individual risk, and then 4 being high individual and community risk. And yes, they are known to cause abortion and need identifying and including in the risk assessment process. So really controls are likely to be needed where the individual is exposed, and the phrase given in the regulations is to a greater risk than they would normally have in the general population. So I'm thinking here that if you are working in a laboratory with biological hazards, then that would cover you're exposed more than you would in the normal population. But generally, working in an area, it's about general hygiene advice. And the one I'm thinking about is things like the recent spate of pandemic flu and all the advice that was given for that. So general risk assessments should cover that. And I think we're now moving to poll question 3.
Well, this is the last of our 3 polls for today's webinar. So we want to know, when managing change and stress issues, what support systems are available to you at your current place of work, or what do you think would be the most helpful? And again, we will leave this open for a while. You can pick any one, and we'll let as many people as possible vote. Your options are human resources and health and safety functions, safety representatives, an employee assistance program in whatever form that might take, or other things that we need, that you may think you need. And again, in the questions or in the comments, then you're welcome to say what those other things might be if you have a specific example that you'd like to give. So just over half of you have voted, so I'm going to leave a little bit longer to let a few more people have their say. Although I have to say, looking at the results as they're coming in, there seems right now to be a very clear winner. We'll give it a few more seconds, as plenty of you now, I think, have voted. And then we've got the rest of the presentation, after which we're going to put any of your questions across. We had a couple of questions in already. I know I've got a couple of my own as well, and we had one by email in advance of the webinar. If you think of something after the webinar is over, then do please drop us an email and we will do our best to answer it for you, or to find somebody who can. I think that's probably plenty of you now, so we'll close the poll. And as I said, from early indications, it seems there's a strong winner in human resources and the health and safety functions. That seems to be the support systems that are already available, or that people would find the most helpful. Probably no surprise to you there, Ayla.
No, that's not at all. I think it's mainly about having somewhere that's confidential, which is outside of the normal supervisory hierarchy that people can go to, that's got an open door. So that seems to work well.
Okay, well, I will let you get on with the rest of the presentation, and then we'll come to these questions shortly.
Okay, so moving now to the next set of hazards, so ergonomic hazards. So related to lifting, musculoskeletal or manual handling, workstation design and things like that. Again, there's a lot of information out there on ergonomic hazards, and it's already covered in some of the general risk assessments that you will have. But here we need to consider the body changes, the hormonal changes, and because the body changes shape in the 3 different trimesters, then it can have issues on easier strain, pressure on the diaphragm causing shortness of breath, lack of balance. So also all parts of the body show signs of stretching and separating to allow room, so things are quite relaxed, so you can easily strain yourself. And one of the things that I was thinking of earlier on is about just lifting and the centre of gravity. So if any of you've got a mug or anything in front of you with anything in it, or something not too heavy, just hold it close to your body and just lift it gently, and then hold it further away at arm's length and lift it again, and you can feel the strain of your lower back. So imagine when you are pregnant and you're getting much bigger, just lifting at a distance is really changing your center of gravity and affecting how you feel and how off balance. So things that you normally wouldn't even think about, you're suddenly starting to need to change the way you do things to prevent strain on the back and back pain. So for ergonomic hazards, you are looking at different risks of premature birth, low birth rate, and that's thought to be affected by heavy physical exertion, heavy lifting, prolonged standing, fatigue, and there's lots of guidance out there again on the HSE website looking at long working hours and heavy physical exertion that's causing issues with that. So things to avoid: awkward postures, heavy lifting, high impact work, strenuous work, and work that requires balance. Again, a lot of this is to do with maternal health, where you are in the pregnancy and the work that you're doing, because all of those will affect this. Work in confined spaces probably isn't recommended, and facilities where there's no rest facility, or processes where there's no rest facility. So if you just think again at workstation design, I know many of us know that how we're supposed to sit, but if you just think about the way your body will change, and having proper lumbar support is really important with a foot rest, because that pushes you back to gain more lumbar support, and it also takes the strain off the back of the legs to ensure there's blood flow. And something I always encourage is getting up, walking around, regular movement. Avoid being stagnant, so keep the body active, and just as you normally would with normal workstation assessments, tell people to take a break, get up, walk around, do something different, but maybe you might need to do that more regularly than you would normally. So just thinking about some of the other hazards, psychological hazards on maternal health. Stress is a common risk during pregnancy due to the changing effects, and that could be the workload, feeling vulnerable, feeling that you're unable to do things, hormonal changes, emotional changes, more tiredness than normal. And this is why looking at a regular review of the risk assessment and having support structures in place is really important. So as we said from the polls, having somewhere to go to, somebody to talk to, confidentially, which is outside of the normal hierarchy of supervision in the area. So it all helps with reducing the stress levels and looking at some flexible working type issues to allow for that. And the other factor with that is maternal health. So looking at medical conditions, high blood pressure, back pain are very common. So these need to be taken into account, as well as does frequent rest breaks, access to food, toilets, any rest areas, and looking at any shift work or working hour changes. Sometimes additional home working might be a flexibility that, or reducing the working hours of the day may help that. And again, I'd stress, include recommendations from health professionals and anything that's come up from occupational health, the GP or midwife, and that needs to be taken into consideration at all times. So other considerations, so moving on to return to work, and new mothers wishing to breastfeed should provide their employer with written notification of their intention to do this, so that then you can the risk can be assessed. So it does say that facilities should be available for this. For rest is a requirement, and it's just recommended that a private, healthy and safe environment to express and store milk is provided. So it's made as a recommendation. Emergency evacuation, think of, these are some of the other considerations to make. So in the later stages of pregnancy, think of agility, reach, balance, speed of movement. They can be particularly compromised during the later stages. So just as you would under fire regulation, think about personal evacuation plans and include that in your risk assessment. And one that also needs to be considered if people are wearing workwear or personal protective equipment. So you may need to look at that because it may no longer fit correctly. And I'm thinking here of trousers, and you can get extendable parts to the trousers that can allow normal trousers to be worn, so you're not getting bigger and bigger trousers. Okay, so evaluating the risk and control measures. So the established hierarchy of controls should be applied for risks to general and nursing mothers, just as with managing risks to the general working population. However, as I said before, some of the residual risks will have to be significantly lower with special measures. So again, use the same hierarchy of eliminate, reduce, isolate, control, safe systems of work, and PPE being your last resort. But in certain areas, when you're dealing with the reproductive toxicants and the risk isn't low enough, when you're thinking about the hazards here, all these control measures have to be working and in place even when you've got layered controls. So sometimes just the risk of exposure is enough to stress the individual, so you need to take that into account. The last part, really, looking at monitoring and review of your risk assessments. Things change, and things change fairly quickly, so it's quite dynamic. So in the 3 trimesters of pregnancy, then the body is very different, so there's lots of different issues to look at. So I do recommend that you review at the rate that's appropriate to that individual and consult with them on a regular basis just to see if everything's all right. It can just be a general conversation, and anything new that's coming from the GP or midwife having a bearing on the review of the risk assessment. And like I said earlier, it's that open door policy and being able to discuss things outside of general line management. So just as a general summary then, so the health and safety implications for new and expectant mothers can be addressed by normal health and safety management procedures. It is actually all there, but you just need to consider the lower risk requirement, because working conditions generally considered acceptable may no longer be sufficient. So that's why a specific risk assessment is recommended. Use the general standard 5 steps process and have your procedure ready with all your information as an aid memoir to the process, but also do your systematic and structured examination of the premises, the processes you're handling, any work activities, and look at it, look at the area, and use all the information that you've got from general risk assessments already. Consult with the individual concerned regularly and handle all information and discussions with confidentiality and sensitivity. And from the poll, we know that everybody's used to doing that anyway with accidents and incidents, so that's not an issue, but it could be. And take into account any other information from medical professionals, your on-site support, and conduct regular reviews of the assessment throughout the pregnancy. And then again, not forgetting to review it on return to work, because there are still issues in that the new and expectant mother is 6 months, up to 6 months, and quite a lot of people do return to work before that period, and then there's breastfeeding after that, so they do need to be reviewed. So my recommended further reading and sources of information are the HSE website first and foremost for all the up-to-date practical guidelines. There's a whole page there on new and expectant mothers with everything linked and listed. publications, the law, helpful links and information. There you will also find a specific guidance on infection risk. There's the different regulations that I cited, and also more information on the Royal Society of Chemistry website and pages. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ayla. We have had a few questions in. I encourage everybody to have a look at those links that were on the previous slide. Again, we will be sharing this afterwards, so you can see any of that again if you'd like to. There are two questions we've had that deal with basically the same thing, from Fiona Slater and from Anna Slater. I've no idea if they're related. But Fiona asks if chemicals are routinely tested for harm for breastfed babies, and so is the absence of the H362, or in your words, old money, the R64, is the absence of that enough to be confident that it's safe? Anna Slater asks a slightly different question with the same theme, which is there a resource listing chemicals which are suspected to cause harm to breastfed children? So where should people go to look for this, and is it a case that if that hazard mark isn't on it, we can assume it is safe, or is it just saying if the hazard mark isn't on it, it hasn't been assessed for its safety?
I would say your latter. I mean, the first point of call is your safety data sheet. However, depending on how much of the chemical is marketed or whether it's laboratory scale, then the different testing may not have got been required by legislation for under REACH. So it might not be there. So then you're looking about what do we know about this chemical? Are there similar chemicals that have the same kind of effect? And I'd say, best to err on the side of caution if something's not listed or isn't of sufficient quantity to have all the testing done on it.
So Anna does say that she's a research chemist who regularly handles organic solvents. In a research situation, it may be that because it's not being used in sort of industrial bulk, it may be that the data isn't there yet. So that's the sort of thing where you'd want to look a bit more carefully about the data that is available, perhaps consult a few more people before making any decisions.
Yeah, and I'd also look at what like compounds, what's the information on similar structures that might give you a bit more, and involve people as you can. But quite often R&D quantities and low quantities, you're not going to have all the hazards listed, so yes, you'd have to be more careful.
Another question from a research chemist, actually, Laura Gonzalez Macia. She says she works in chemistry research. If she does get pregnant, what's the first thing that she should do? Should she talk to her line manager or the health and safety unit? She says she's not confident about working in the lab, and could the university force you to continue working?
I think the first thing that you'd look at is your cost assessments. So again, we're going back to the same question you've just asked about. Well, in the absence of a hazard, is there a hazard? But first of all, you're looking at your cost assessment. So that should notify you that there is an issue. But also the general risk assessments already provided. If we look, right at the start of my presentation, I said about if there's a specified risk, then you have to notify women of childbearing age and pregnant new mothers that they need to notify you if they become pregnant. So if there's a risk there that's already been identified, then you should have been made aware of it. So if you put that up against the cost assessment with the further information, and the third question you ask was where should she go, I would have said in the absence of any other information, you would go to somewhere that's confidential to start with. So maybe human resources might be the first port of call to ask, what are the procedures and the processes we have got and who should I be talking to?
Excellent, thank you. We are running out of time, but we do still have a couple more questions that I'd like to get through. This one is from Brian Newton, and she actually emailed this to us in advance. She says the control of lead at work specifies 30 as the limit for blood in women of childbearing age, but the Lead Association recommends 10 as a limit. Her occupational health provider does say that the limit is 10 that they're aiming for, but because of the line of work, they can't actually get down to 10. They're finding about 18 is the norm. I mean, does that mean, in her words, that they have to stop employing women of childbearing age because they can't get the levels below the recommendation?
I think it's like everything. It's about the list of control measures required, and all those controls have to be in place with that hierarchy. So again, it's the risk of exposure. I'm not specific to lead, but there are specific regulations for that. And I've seen, it said where pregnant women have blood levels of 5 or higher, then you need to start acting as look at sources of lead exposure for that. And I've seen 10 as well. And then action levels at 45. So I think to be specific to lead, you need to look at the guidance for lead and the legal requirements for lead. And there is some guidance out there for management of lead exposure in pregnant and lactating women. So I would go with the recommendations of the occupational physicians for that and the guidance that's out there, because it depends on the controls and how sufficient the controls are.
Of course, yeah. Obviously, every situation is going to be different. This other question is from Nigel Cussans, and this sort of relates to something I was going to ask. He said, what about hazards that could be introduced by others? So if there's new radioactivity or X-ray use nearby, which could perturb an area that's already been assessed. Now, that feeds into the question I was going to ask, which is, how regularly should you be assessing this? And, how much assessment is too much?
Yeah, I think because I threw in the pre-task risk assessment, because I like that one. So you've already got your risk assessment in place. You've looked at all the hazards and risks. You've been around the area. You've talked to the person. You think you've done a fairly thorough job. Things change. People change. There might be demolishing in an area or decommissioning or new hazards. So it's about being aware and having your eyes open and doing some kind of everyday pre-task risk assessment that's not just looking at the task, but it's what has changed today. Is there anything different that I need to assess the risk of? So I suppose rather than overdoing it, it's just about having your eyes open and being aware. And if there are things that you are concerned about, then it's about notifying somebody and asking what's going on. Is that going to affect the hazards that I'm exposed to, or vice versa?
So I guess the trick is to have a sort of dynamic and light-footed process that you can use so that when something does change, you are then in a good position to be able to respond to it quickly.
Yeah, I think it's also arming the individual as well to have their eyes open. So if it's yourself that's the pregnant woman, or you've help them assess the risk and the risk assessment process. It's about saying, well, look, have your eyes open, see if anything changes, let us know if you have got issues, because on a daily basis something different may be new, and that could be due to just the maternal health issue or a new hazard that's emerged. And it's a way of keeping it very dynamic because things change all the time.
Well, thank you very much. We have run over, so we really should bring this to a close. Thank you to everybody who has joined us for this afternoon's webinar. There's been a lot of people here who've been very attentive throughout. Thank you for your involvement in the polls. Thank you for asking questions. Thank you, Ayla, for joining us. It's been a fascinating insight into something that is a big concern to a lot of people, and making sure that we get this right is obviously very important. The recording of this webinar will be sent out to everybody that registered, so if you want to go back and see other bits or listen to things again, you will find that link should be with you fairly soon. I, again, am Ben Valsler from Chemistry World. Thank you to Ayla Bursnell from Ayla Bursnell Limited, and we hope to see you in the next Chemistry World webinar. Thanks again.
Thank you.